The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey everybody, welcome to today's training session on requirements management. Today I'll be showing you some of the best practices and kind of explain a few things that are within DevSpec or our requirements module. Um, okay, so before we get started, let me just make sure everybody's here. Give me one sec. Okay, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to use the GoToWebinar panel to type in your questions, and I'll try to answer them maybe towards the end of this training session. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so again, today we're going to be talking a little bit about the requirements, and that's basically the requirements module within DevSuite. So just a refresher, the way I have it set up is I have only one requirement, project, if you will. It's really called a project base because the projects are going to be inside this tree. So um, just as a refresher, the root folders that you see here, content sharing manager, another product or project, that's typically how you would set up the requirements view. So every one of these root folders should represent either a project or a product. And then when you expand it, you should see different modules, and you can create as many folders as you need to represent whatever components you want to capture. And so if you click on any folder, it's just like Windows Explorer, where on the right hand side it'll present a list of requirements and specifications specific for that component. Okay, and then also I enabled a feature that typically not a lot of people know about, but you do have a way of grouping these projects together. So I'm going to go ahead and expand that folder. So if you have multiple similar projects, let's just say you have a program that contains multiple projects, you could potentially, create something like this at the root folder where you have a program and then all of the related projects underneath. So it's a grouping feature just as, just to help you organize your projects a little bit better. But generally, we work with each one of these, what we call requirement spaces. So to create that, you basically would just right click. If you have the privileges to do so, you would just right click and you would do a new requirement space. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'll just call it a new project. And then I'm going to go ahead and submit. And then the root folder should come out right away. You do have the ability to organize this, move this folder up or down, things like that. So, we can do as a child folder of something else, as a sibling um, of other folders. So as a child folder, you probably wouldn't be able to do this only because this is at the root level. This is a requirement space, so it doesn't make sense to have that underneath another requirement space. But you do have the capability of moving things up and down and kind of just organize this a little bit better. The next important thing you want to do is, let's just say you're using some of the other modules like development or even test cases, some of these other modules. What you want to do is you want to link this project to those. So what I mean by that is I'm going to go into our development module and I'm going to create the exact same thing, but inside development it's called a new dev space instead of a new requirement space. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing here, new project. And what we want to do here is actually want to link everything together. So unfortunately, it's a couple of different, multiple clicks to do something like this. But you want to make sure you do that linking. Um, the reason for the linking is so that when you're actually working on or, bringing requirements or specs into development, you're going to make sure that the new project requirements or specs carry over to only this folder and nothing else, and so that they're not shared. Okay, so the way you would do that is you would just right click, and you could have done it when you created a new space, but I'm going to go ahead and edit this one. And there's always a tab called link spaces, and in here you can see link development spaces. I just want to go ahead and select new project there. Okay, so I'm going to hit that. And then essentially these two projects are now linked together. So essentially they're the same project, but it's just basically enforces the fact that I can't, bring these requirements over to a different product or project on accident. And then similarly, inside development, you can do the same thing. So if I go edit, there's always this space link here. So you can kind of see in requirements, I already got a new project here. If I, created it inside our testing module, I would do exactly the same thing. Link, the new project test case space with our requirements. So that's essentially how you get started when you start a brand new project or you create something inside the requirements module. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize some of the stuff, and I'm going to show you now a little bit of the differences of what a requirement versus a spec means. So in our last session, I talked about the green icons being requirements. So if you can see here, we have a bunch of different requirements, and I kept it very generic. So the reason for this is the requirements are supposed to just capture what stakeholders want or need, right? And then basically, generally it's going to be something very generic, something that development might not necessarily be able to implement just yet. So it's very high level, it's vague, it's not ready for development. So what I did was then I break those down into smaller specs, right? And those are going to be much more detailed. So the way I would do that is I can either right click or I can click new here. And I have specs versus requirements. So before I create anything, inside your system, inside any, when you're starting off, you're going to see, you might see actually specs and you might see epics. Um, I'm not sure what the reasoning for that is, but you can rename, these things, these types. So I'm going to show you how to do that real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and open the admin. So if you have access to the admin, you can do something very similar. So the first thing I would do is I would go under workflow and then I would go to spec type settings. And then you're going to see these following system types. So we have specifications, we have epics, we have epic documents. But what I did was I renamed it. I'm not going to be using the epic documents, so I just basically said not use. But I want to make sure, epics, I name them as requirements, and then specifications, I name it as specs. So you can create as many types as you need. Um, yeah, to capture whatever you're tracking. So I'm going to go ahead and say, maybe create something, a new specification called risk analysis or something like that. And I'm going to hit OK. And then basically I have a new type. Okay, now it's a specification type. I'm going to go ahead and save that and then reload it. Now, the reason for these system types, specifications versus, epics or requirements, is such that generally you cannot assign requirements into development. So if I try to do something like this, assign to development, it's not going to work. So only these items that are of the spec system type can be assigned. So what that means is all of the items that have been assigned to development in here, these blue icons, they're actually copies of the specifications and not the requirements. So again, it reinforces the fact that requirements are that generic um, capture of what people need, but the specs are actually what's meant for development. So after I refresh, I'm going to go ahead and reload here. I should be able to see a new type here, and I have my risk analysis. Okay, so you can create as many as you need. You can rename these if you wanted to. This guy, requirements document, it basically is, it uses our Word add-in for capturing requirements. So let's just say you had a Word document that has multiple, requirements or even specs within it. You can actually upload that, and then what it will do is it'll create a requirement that has that Word document as an attachment, and it'll actually read through the Word document and capture all the specs and break them down like this. So this will be the Word document, and then everything it found inside by using tags or keywords will be represented as the specs underneath. So since I'm not going to be doing that, manually, there's no way or no need to ever, use that. So unfortunately, I can't get rid of it. So I just basically, have that renamed. Okay, so that's the requirements versus specs. So I'm going to go ahead and create this right now. So I'm going to go ahead and take our high level requirement and I'm going to break it down again. So basically, I just right click, I do new as child. As long as you have it highlighted, then what you're going to see is the parent right here will represent what I selected. So the parent for this particular spec would be that high level requirement. But I want to show you another feature here. There's something called templates that people often ask, and what is that field? Why is it there? So what that really is allows you to pre-populate some of these fields. So how that's useful is when I click on that, I'm able to look at a list of my templates right here, and you can kind of see. So I'm going to go ahead and use this one right here. I'm going to check it off. I'm going to hit OK. It's going to pre-populate that. So it's pretty useful for people that are actually entering in data to see exactly what you guys want to capture in what kind of format. So here I have the description. I want to put some data there. I may want to put the test procedure there. I could have created another field for testing. And the reason I do that is because these specs can be used for test cases. Okay, so basically I just want to make sure I capture all of that relevant data, and I want to make sure that people do fill this out um, according to the format that I laid out. Okay, so that's what the templates are for. So I'm not going to submit that just yet. I want to show you guys how I can do that. Um, Depending on the version you have, I have the latest version, 10.1.2. But there's this little settings icon up here, and then you can go into the template view, and that's where I'm actually selecting things, the templates from. So I have template root, and then basically I can do something like this. I'll just create a new spec here, and actually I have that open. So I'm gonna go ahead and do new spec, and then here I can define my format, right? So I can say title, um, and then just create something. And then here's my format, right? So I can use the HTML controls and make that bold, etc. Just lay it out. And then so basically I have my template now. I could potentially, have some of the other fields pre-populated for me, even attachments too. So I'm gonna go ahead and submit that. And now that becomes something that I can use when I'm creating a new requirement or a new spec. Okay, so to get out of that view, I'm just gonna go back into the list view, and then I can do new, and then I'm gonna create a new spec as child. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then the new template that I entered is available for me to use. Okay, so I'm just going to randomly pick something here, hit OK, and then basically we have that format that we want to use. Okay, so this will be smaller text spec 3. All right, and I'm just going to put in some data here, and then go ahead and submit. All right, so now I have this, and generally what I want to do is I want to just go ahead and refresh, and then I'm able to see the hierarchy. Okay, so this hierarchy is unlimited. So if you wanted to actually, create children or grandchildren, or even, basically capture the impacts of these different specifications related to each other, you can do so. So I can keep doing that. I can keep creating new as child, and I can have an unlimited layer. So the top right here, the relationship tree view, is for exactly that purpose. So inside the task list view, it's really like your work pane, really for you to modify things. But if you so what that means is you can actually make changes here by doing inline editing or clicking into the spec itself. But you at most in this view can only see one layer. Okay, so you can kind of see the parent-child, but you can't see like the grandchildren or even other leaf nodes in this view. So that's what this guy would be for, the relationship tree view, if there were more than one level. Okay, so I'm not going to switch to that, but oh, actually I will. I'll switch to that, and then you can kind of see. So it's more of a presentational view of the work pane here. Okay, so that's what that is. Now, a little bit more about the requirement versus specification types. So there's a lot more that you can do with this. So basically, when you have types, it can actually overwrite, or actually, what I mean by overwrite is that it can actually capture different fields per type. So let's just say you wanted to capture Here, I'll open this one right here. You can see that it's only got these basic fields, title, status, spec, owner, who's actually the author of the requirement, and then description, and then the attachment. Um, Versus if I open a spec, I should be able to see more fields. So I added components here, I added interfaces here, custom. So this form that you're looking at is actually derived from the type. Okay, so in the admin, as long as you enable the types right here, down below under the GUI settings, so that would be spec GUI settings, you will see that I basically did something like this right here. So under system pages, this is my description page right here. And over here, you have this option can overwrite. So basically what I did is I created two different pages for the description. So this one is the requirements, doesn't have those fields that the specs do. Okay, so the specs has that component, interface, etc. And then I would go over to the override option, which is on the top right here, overwrite, and then I could basically say for specs, which page do I want to use, right? Versus for requirements, which page I want to use. Now, if you didn't turn this guy on, what default is it would be this top page. So that means for this particular type, it'll just use the default, which is this guy up on the top. So you could potentially overwrite what you have, okay, depending on the type. So that's what that guy does. Going to talk a little bit about the workflow too. So in the workflow, the spec, this is my specifications versus requirements workflow. You can do something identical to the different pages for different types. So I can essentially have different workflows for different types. So I didn't set it up that way. Right now, all my requirements, my specs are traversing through the same workflow, but generally, this can be customized to whatever process you guys feel is needed. All right, so basically new, this is an invisible state. It's just a starting point, but you're able to, start drawing states. So I'm gonna go ahead and right click. I'm gonna say add state, and maybe I wanna do something like this on hold, right? Because I just don't have enough data there yet. So what I can do is, create that, and then basically I'm gonna just draw a transition line to it. And I'm just gonna call that need more info. All right, so now I have a new state as part of my workflow, and then it's as simple as that. You basically just create states, and then go ahead and draw transition lines, and then once you're done, you save it, reload it, and it should carry over to the front end. Okay, now um, about this workflow, this is just a sample workflow that I have, and yours may be very different, but similar in a way. So basically what I'm saying in my workflow is that for all new requirements or new specs, I want to send it over to the review state. And then I actually want to get approvals for that before I send it over to, maybe perhaps designing the designing phase. Okay, so it's a pretty waterfall approach. I have review, get their approval, and then once it's approved, then I can, work on that spec or that requirement, and then finally send it over to development, and then send it over to testing once development is done and completed. All right, so that's all good right here, but there's something called spec state automation. Okay, so over here, this is going to control or set a standard on when you can send things over to development. Okay, so the very first option that I have here is planning implementation is allowed in the following spec states. So what I'm saying is um, only when something is inside development. So this guy's in review right now, but if I work it through the push it through forward in the workflow, eventually I'll get to development. But what this means is that at the review state, I'm not able to assign to development or assign to backlog. Okay, so these two options won't be possible if I turn that feature on. So it restricts which states you can use to send things over to the development module. Okay, and then now what is also very helpful is basically have some of this automation down here too. So right here, auto set specification states when all development tasks are assigned. Okay, so what that means is that, instead of you manually pressing buttons to move it through the workflow, it'll actually do that automatically for us. So what I mean by that is if I go into a spec right here, these are the transition buttons that I drawn on the workflow. Okay, so right now it's in review, and these are the following 3 actions that I can take. So it'll be this line right here, this line, and then this line. So these 3 transitions or actions. So right now I'm going to go ahead and manually move it forward, need approval, and I'm going to go ahead and save. And then when I do something like that, maybe the owner right here is going to be an approver. There's also electronic signatures that I didn't enable, but let's say if I wasn't an approver, I would actually have to log in and um, provide my credentials before I can hit this approve button. But I don't have that feature turned on, so I'm just going to hit save, and then I'm going to say ready for dev. Okay. So what that means is now I'm able to go ahead and right click and assign to development. So I can do something like this, assign to development, and these are the development tasks that will be created with this particular specification. Okay, so what that means is inside the development module, if I come into one of these guys right here, let me find one that has data. These will be the following development tasks that need to be completed in order to complete that specification. So I can choose to create that, as I'm assigning the spec over to, any particular release or sprint. So this will be the development tree here. And then notice, I don't have to actually select any folders because I did that linking already. So content sharing manager stuff should go to content sharing manager project within development. So by doing that, I'm able to go ahead and just see the folders underneath. So I'm just going to go ahead and assign to a sprint versus assigning to a backlog. So if I, don't want to directly assign to something that's ongoing, I could perhaps move it to the backlog first, right? So I'm going to hit OK here. And then inside development, I can go ahead and refresh this. So under here, under version 2, sprint 4, I should see this guy right here. And that's the development task. Okay, so now these guys have their own workflow, right? So it's different from your specification workflow, but that's what this feature is for. So um, when I bring you back over to the spec state automation down here, I can say when all those development tasks, when all those children tasks are completed, then or assigned, right? Or I'm gonna skip this one for now. When all of those guys are completed or closed, then I'm gonna automatically move the parent specification to in testing. Okay, so then that way you don't have to go in here and then manually, click on ready for testing or things like that. Okay, so that's what that feature is for. Now, the other thing about this too is you'll see that I have a percent finish right here. So everything rolls up inside DevSuite. So what I did here is basically customize my list view. You can do that by coming in here, clicking on the little settings icon, hit customize, and add whatever field you want. But the percent finish is the one that's going to capture that roll up. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add percent finish. But as I'm working on these tasks here, they're going to each have their own percentages. So as I'm modifying this, it's going to go ahead and roll up into my requirement. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick. So let's close that. Um, and then the way you would do that is you would go into the status here. Let's just say there's 2 hours remaining. So it's based on time actually. So I'm gonna say there's 2 hours remaining, and then there's 2 hours that we spent on it, right? So I think that will give us a 50% right there, and that's gonna go ahead and roll up to this guy here. So I'm just gonna refresh this tree or this view real quick, and then you should see that that's a roll up right there with the 50%. Okay, so that's essentially how you would do um, or capture development tasks with specifications. Okay, so again, these green icons, you wouldn't necessarily, assign that to development. So, but only these specs, these children's specs. Okay, so that's it for today's session. We're going to be recording, 5-minute videos on, everything that I've shown here in more detail. For example, how did I set up, a group of projects? So I'm going to go ahead and, provide you guys with links after this. But yeah, that's all in the, it's going to be an email forwarded to you shortly. And thank you for joining the session. We're going to have another session, I think, in 2 weeks, and it's going to cover more requirements, best practices, things like the baseline, and then also the change request view, which I don't have enabled here. We're going to cover some more advanced features in the next session. So thank you all for joining again. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Or info, at techexcel.com or support@techexcel.com. Thank you guys.